Right, guys, welcome back to the Untitled Fitness podcast show. I have Luke Miller, who, if you guys are familiar with John Jewett, he has a lot of really fantastic content with John with their J3 University. But Luke is also extremely knowledgeable. He has his certified strength and conditioning specialist from the NCSA, which for those of you who don't know, you have like an actual bachelor's degree in exercise science to have that. He's also a competitive bodybuilder. I believe that he is actually just wrapping up. I saw a bunch of updates on Instagram, just wrapping up a pretty extended off season full of gaining lots of size to move up to the open, I believe. He's also a coach, and he produces a lot of content around physique developments. And so, yeah, if you guys haven't heard of him, you're in for a treat because we're going to dive into some things that I don't think Lucas had really had a chance to really talk about much on the other platforms. So, Luke, is there anything else that you want to say about yourself?
Yeah, and just maybe some reference point for the clientele or for the listeners is educational background for me. I have an undergrad degree in engineering, so mechanical engineering that did biomedical based research, a grad degree in exercise physiology. So a lot of background in just mechanics of movement before I went into grad school for the physiology side of things. And then all of my coaching right now is through No Switch Fitness, which is kind of where all the platforms are, which is kind of geared around taking no all switch in the pursuit of results, right? And creating that culture of winning athletes with the coaching at a high level and understanding the details of every aspect of the process. So honestly, I'm excited to dive into today's conversation. I think this is potentially a concept that could be discussed and utilized a little bit more across the board when we consider coaching models for athletes. So I'm just ready to dive in, to be honest.
Yeah, so I guess first just dive into things. I wanted to pick your brain on so for bodybuilders and for strength athletes, muscle growth is a huge aspect of this long-term development. Kind of always want to be trying to gain some sort of muscle over time because that makes you more competitive on a bodybuilding stage and in general more competitive as a strength athlete. So I wanted to sort of ask you about in sort of a model with bodybuilders and with strength athletes, how important did you view the goal of like progressive tension overload as the driver of hypertrophy, and how much do you think that a program should be basically centered around that concept versus potentially other models of hypertrophy? I guess, like, what is your preferred model for hypertrophy across the training career?
Yeah, I think we try to divide things into camps sometimes where we're all talking about the same thing in different ways. So just to kind of potentially add some context here, mechanical tension is the main driver of hypertrophy, okay? And we can't get away from that, and we need to create a progressive mechanical tension stimulus over time. That being said, there is a relationship of that in understanding that one, mechanical tension is driven through multiple factors. So this could be considering not only the load on the bar, but execution parameters, being able to bias setups in order to drive more mechanical tension towards the body part, taking into consideration of the fatigue model that overlaps in that with how much mechanical tension we can drive towards the body part when there's fatigue overlaid on top of that, including metabolite accumulation. So multiple factors here. I think when we look at like progressive overload versus the volume debate, really just how we should view this is mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy. Volume is the dose at which we provide that mechanical tension stimulus. And so just like a blood pressure medication, like if you're using 20 milligrams of telmisartan to manage your blood pressure, it's not working and your blood pressure is still trending high, we progress that medication up to 40 milligrams or to a higher dose to manage it. Same thing comes with providing a mechanical tension stimulus for hypertrophy. And then we just find that progressive model that works for the athlete that allows them to find the sweet spot of adaptation over a longer period of time.
Cool. So in regards to sort of volume landmarks, I know there are a couple of camps of, and I know you said, you don't like to divide it into camps, and you think there's more so principles that we should all follow. But obviously there's the minimum effective volume, and mostly maintenance too. But in terms of gains, we're not interested in that. Minimum effective, maximum adaptive, maximum recoverable. Do you think that sort of that essentially resting from maximum effective volumes to maybe maximum recoverable volumes, or should we mostly try to just find, like you said, that sweet spot of adaptation, sort of the maximum adaptive, and sort of progress in there via mechanical tension? Because I know that in some models, and obviously this might be dependent upon like psychology of athletes too, and like what they prefer, but in general, there is some sort of injury risk also associated with sort of pushing towards that MRV, and you can get a lot of other things that could potentially harm. But there's also potentially some benefits of potentially functionally overreaching and reaching that MRV. So is there any sort of context in where you would use either of approaches, or is there one that you just tend to bias?
Yeah, so I think, just to give credit where credit's due, the terminology originally came from Renaissance periodization, the whole Isertel crew, right? To conceptually be able to discuss this volume landmarks thing from a programming perspective. And I think that when we look at like these volume progressions over time, and kind of where I lean towards with a lot of my athletes, if the psychological profile fits, is the range between the rock bottom volume versus the top end volume is probably a little bit narrower than the range of volume accumulation with people who are progressing all the way from MEV to MRV. Because I can tell you right now, if we think about this in terms of like a reverse U curve, where you kind of find that MEV on the lower portion, where you accumulate up to MAV and then back down to MRV. The scope of progression is kind of within that peak area. So the number of sets that are progressed across a block is not as much added, but the net stimulus across is going to be equal or potentially even more, because I'm not pushing these athletes into MRV as fast as, or even a place where they need to deload, because I'm not pushing them to MRV most of the time as soon. So you're not taking these deloads as frequently within a model like this. So essentially what's happening is you're using the subjective metrics, the subjective markers of like sleep quality and desire to train, pumps, a couple other things, digestion, to guide when you're making that decision around the deloads. And the volume progression is kind of hovering around maximum adaptable, but it's starting below, probably somewhere between MEV and MAV, and then it's ending a little bit past MAV. And so we're basically just catching that athlete before we get into close to MRV, where it takes so long to recoup from that. And then we spend not only a week deloading, but then we spend a second week at a volume set that's so low that it's barely creating a progressive stimulus. So I would just say the difference from a volume landmark perspective would just be the extremes of the bottoms and the end range. But then if you calculated the work across a training block, it's going to be fairly similar, or slightly more, because we're getting progressive work weeks for a longer scale period of time.
Yeah, so I guess it's sort of the concept of area under the curve. Essentially when you're actually making progress versus when you're not, because I have definitely played around with both models with myself and also my athletes, and I found that from a psychological perspective, especially, like it's really hard to go to the gym and make progress, and I also think it's more inherently just fatiguing just from that perspective too. Like when you are pushing towards MRV, when you just feel like complete crap, and you're also having to get in all the volume, like especially in a tail end of a powerlifting peaking phase. Like how I used to do things is I would really try to overreach my guy. Really, like this is early on in my training career. They'd be feeling pretty garbage, and then there's basically a less predictable results. I also think in terms of strength performance, and also I think that in terms of hypertrophy too, there's probably a little bit less of a predictable progressive stimulus, like you said, because you spend time, like if you sort of break yourself and you have to rebuild once you get past that point. And so what I usually like to do is my deload weeks are, one, it's mostly, if somebody is really feeling just beat up from a joint and connective tissue perspective, especially. And I tend to bias a little bit more towards intro weeks, or maybe we're having one less set on those weeks, maybe it's slightly lower in intensities, but it still is basically within that range of maximum adaptive volumes. It just is slightly less. And I got that concept kind of from my own coach, which just analyzing how he programs for me and how my progress has been since I sort of changed that. So what are some markers that you look for in terms of knowing if you're probably training well with enough volume?
So training with enough volume, there's a couple things we could look for in regards to this. Mainly, it's going to be rate of recovery capacity. So how quick is this individual recovering session to session? The rate at which they're taking logbook progressions can be a sign as well. There's a couple things that we can kind of see. So first off would be like really large jumps in a logbook progression. And this would be kind of ones that you wouldn't expect to see. So almost like a strength adaptation occurring because the volume is so low. You'll see this in like strength-based programming, is like there is a large volume differential between strength-based programming and hypertrophy-based programming, right? And so we can actually see that present itself when the volume set's too low. A lot of this can be avoided though by taking a history of the athlete. And so what I would say is, like, as far as setting a volume set too low, a lot of times that occurs when we're not taking the time on intake to look at the history of the athlete. We have data out of, I believe it's the University of Tampa, with, what is the crew out of there? I did research out of there for a semester.
Bill Campbell?
No, Campbell's USF. That's my grad school. I went to USF for grad school.
Yeah.
Drawing a blank, but the crew out of UT, with kind of like reference to someone's pre-existing volume level could influence how they adapt to an overall training volume in later programming blocks. So we can look at someone's pre-existing training history to potentially predict what would be too low of a volume set for that individual in the starting block going into this. And so some things to consider within that would be, one, is their training quality high? So are they leaving progress or stimulus on the table because their execution is not very good? That would be something to consider within the volume set that's programmed. And then two, within that would be, are they making progress? If they're not making progress with the volume set that they've had before, and they're not running into recovery issues, then that may be also a sign that we're kind of not training at enough volume. Very inter-individual and will change as that skill arises over time. Just as a general recommendation, I actually just recorded a lecture on this. Beginners typically fall somewhere in between the 5 to 10 sets per body part per week. Intermediate to advanced, somewhere in that 8 to 20 sets per body part per week. As you can see, that range for the intermediate to advanced is rather large. But that's also because it depends on the quality of the stimulus. And for example, for an advanced athlete that's squatting 600 for 10, it's like that's going to carry a lot of fatigue alongside that stimulus. It's a very large stimulus as well. It's probably not going to take quite as many sets to get the total stimulus we need to progress. So a lot to consider. Mainly what I'm looking for is, what does the rate of progress look like? And then based off previous history, is this a large change in the volume set? If it is, then I'm probably not taking them there in the first place to pull them that low.
Cool. So essentially it's mostly just be able to make consistent, like, adding like maybe like 5 pounds or 1 rep to their sets, without getting like so beat up where that we're seeing recovery markers decline.
Something that can skew this is PED implementation. Obviously, because we are going to see that performance jump with PED implementation. So you do have to take that with like a grain of salt. But we know with PED implementation, once we accumulate to peak levels, that the recovery capacity is really high anyway. So we should already be accumulating volume in the forefront. So, there are considerations to have, but it just depends on the block too.
I think that's actually an interesting conversation just to delve into in terms of natural versus enhanced. Obviously, there are times when a PD user is going to be having bridge phases or maintenance phases where they're just coming on to maybe 2 or 3 milligrams per kilogram dose of basically testosterone, versus when they're having an escalation to a peak dose. In terms of, I guess, on cycle or versus off cycle, quote unquote. If you're familiar with Robert Chavez, he would shoot me for saying that. But do you use your programming strategy different versus if somebody is, I guess, on the cruise or they're actually blasting?
Not so much, man. I think it's just the total stimulus that I'm providing for that athlete. So And just for maybe better terminology, baseline phase being kind of where we're on the baseline amount of compounds that athletes needs in order to maintain or slightly progress tissue, restore health markers, and then obviously accumulation being the phase in which we're accumulating compounds up. So when we pull back to a baseline phase, a lot of the time what that's going to look like is removal of set intensifier. So pulling out drop sets, rest pauses, anything that's included to progress the volume from that nature, potentially depending on how high the volume metric progressed to, removing a set or two from each session, and then letting them ride that for the duration of the baseline phase. So we're not really, I'm not really most of the time pushing volume up across a baseline, depending on how long that baseline phase is. And so we'll typically see it's just kind of like a deload into a removal of total volume, starting a new block. That baseline is also a good place to potentially introduce new movement patterns if you're changing patterns between blocks, to just gain the learning adaptations of these new movements and then go from there.
Cool. Yeah. So I think that's a really good note, because I think that one of the reasons why a lot of obviously there's some the differences in especially with like what sort of family tree you're using. There's going to be loss of some intracellular glycogen water retention. That's super physiological. But essentially one of the biggest reasons why people do lose gains, quote unquote, after they come off is just they just start training like beginners, and then they regress. And so sort of having maybe that 10 to 20% reduction versus addition between phases is probably all you really want to be thinking about. So maybe 2 sets decrease, like and that's about correct.
Yeah, and so it also depends on the athlete, right? Like psychologically, I have some people who prefer to kind of stay in that fluctuating model. It like kind of keeps them looking forward to an addition or a drop or something. So basically, just I even further narrow that range in which I'm accumulating up, and more so lowering the peak volume dose that I'm changing the total volume dose given to. But for most, it's staying rather steady across those phases. But again, it depends on the duration. And it's just keeping the athlete performing and progressing across that phase, where we can then transition them into the next block, because that's kind of where the conversation leads mostly for me, is what's next, right? Because programming is largely stringing phases together into the next phase. And so like an example here is like, if the baseline phase leads into a pre-contest phase, then the amount of fatigue that needs to be on that athlete needs to be very low. I'm probably potentially even deloading them again at the start of prep, just because I'm finding that level at which they're fairly good at adapting to with the introduction of PEDs on contest prep, but moving into a deficit, I'm not going to then accumulate volume from there, because contest prep is essentially a long-term fatigue management process. And so I'm basically trying to manage that by knowing where they can adapt and recover from. I already know from previous blocks what their baseline volume set is. So what I'm able to do is lower the volume every few weeks till we get down to that baseline volume set, which is typically around 6 weeks out, and then hold them there. That way, training is not driving so much fatigue that it then pulls away from the rate of fat loss for that athlete.
Yeah, I love that, because it's essentially my assumption there with that model is like, obviously you said like fatigue management is huge, and like across like really any sort of prep we're going into a competition, whether it's powerlifting or contest prep for a bodybuilding show, it's long-term fatigue management to get you to your end destination and achieve that goal. So mostly I'm assuming you're making an emphasis on like progressive tension overload across that contest prep, or being able to like at least maintain per performance. And essentially once you find that your recovery capacity dwindles as you get down to a more delicate state where you're reaching those more essential levels of body fat, that's when you tend to pull things back and probably alter exercise selection a little bit to account for that, basically amplifying the stimulus to fatigue ratio. So in the context of the contest prep, then like say if somebody's going from like you have a beginning of like a back squat, what how would you sort of change the volume as you go across that prep, as you said? in terms of like exercise selection?
Yeah, so the back squat's a tough one because it's very dependent upon skill, and brace capacity and leverage. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll wave in exercise variability into the program from the start. So let's say like the two squat patterns we're running are a back squat and a hack squat, right? So obviously a back squat requires not only more skill, but more capacity to be able to brace than a hack squat is going to. And so what that allows me to do is as we get into this back into prep, rather than introducing an entirely new movement that could potentially be more fatiguing just from trying to learn the movement itself, what I'm doing is I'm pulling out the back squat and allowing the hack to be the mainstay pattern for the rest of prep so that they're not learning a new pattern, but then they are removing that potential issue that a back squat could present from not being able to brace it well, especially as like when waist sizes are a large change in diameter for an athlete, like this is where this becomes really problematic. So a lot of times you'll see that across both hinging and squatting, to the point that I'll even for some athletes fully remove hinging for the last 2 to 3 weeks of prep, just from a safety concern perspective, depending on how they are doing with tissue retention. But that is something to be aware of. So a lot of times I'm just waving that variability in on the forefront at the start of prep, so that when I get to the back end of prep, it's not movement reintroduction or pulling in a movement that hasn't been there. It's more just removing a movement that's not gaining us a lot of ground.
I think that also provides a lot of that diagnostic clarity of actual like its performance being retained. If you have that one movement that's held constant throughout prep, so like basically if you're maintaining performance on a hack squat, but you're taking away like the back squat for some other variation, probably provides a little more information about like how much tissue you're probably regaining.
Yeah, and so I think one of the big things across a prep is it's never perfect. It's never going to go according to what you have written down for the athlete. And so there is a dynamic of being a coach that's just got to be present. And so we can pre-plan as much as we want, but we need to make the decision that's going to allow the athlete to continue to progress across the contest prep. And so like this, a prime example of this is I have a client, Josh Ponton, who has been prepping for a show in about 4 weeks time. And he had like a slight SI injury kind of mid prep where squatting was pretty problematic for quite a bit. It was kind of lateral TFL, IT band, potentially some SI issue. And so we basically had to kind of create the quad stimulus via other patterns that weren't in the program. But these movements that have been brought in and the change in the workout structure that has resulted as a result of this injury has allowed him to keep performance high on movements that can create a stimulus that is going to retain tissue, and he can progress over time, but not aggravate the injury. So there's plenty of situations where like this textbook situation of being able to move things around and have this pre-planned is just not going to be there. So we need to be aware of that too.
Sure, I think that's like that's the main reason why we have check-ins weekly as coaches, is because there's been a large implementation of AI programs. I think that's that's good. It provides more accessibility to probably better programming than most people have, but that will never replace coaching, because of the main part of the job is just communication, having that relationship with your athlete where they trust you and you're able to change things as needed, because like you said, nothing really ever goes 100% according to plan, and that's life. It's like when you're 8 years old, you wanted to be a firefighter, and that's not who you are right now.
Exactly. Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's something to consider that's important, because and it's part of the reason why like my athletes on prep check in 2 to 3 times a week, is because it's so dynamic, especially the back end of prep, and things are changing rather rapidly. So it just allows me to be a better coach for that athlete.
Sure. Yeah, I really like that. So, I guess going a little bit more into the strength conversation with incorporating hypertrophy movements based on phase. So, let's say in the traditional in modern programming, there's always some sort of undulation in like sort of DUP aspect.
Yeah.
So you're always doing something like that. But in general, the further away that you are for competition, you know, a little bit less specificity, more movement variability as you do get more, you know, higher rep ranges on average. And as you get closer to competition, you know, a little more emphasis on, you know, mainly removing some of those hypertrophy movements because, you know, like you said, like there's differences in volume landmarks and you're trying to maximize strength versus hypertrophy. I guess, so let's say if you are progressing as a strength athlete and you are, say, 6 weeks or 6 months out from your next meet and you're moving up a weight class. So in this hypothetical scenario, I think this is, I guess, how would you, and I know this is a very, very, very broad question, so feel free to like ask more specifics. Moving from and sort of, I guess, first analyzing the training perspective of movements, sort of potential volume landmarks that you're going to be using. How would you progress that from, say, a volume accumulation to an intensification to a peaking phase? And then how would you also manage nutrition across that? Say, for example, me, I'm moving up from 82.5 kilos to 90 kilos, currently 87 kilos. How would you essentially model that? I guess
it's tough. And the reality of it is there's more layers to it than just volume landmarks. And so I'm going to preface this conversation with something that I think is missing in a lot of programming. So my first step with an athlete like that would be a movement analysis. So watching how they move in the base 3, potentially going over an injury profile, walking them through some tests to test and see, do we have discrepancies left and rights? What does the overall movement of the athlete look like? And then I'm going to be using the hypertrophy program to address that. And the reason being is because hypertrophy is a rather forgiving adaptation. So if it's progressive in nature over time, it's going to result in more skeletal muscle tissue accumulation. For a strength athlete, hypertrophy is a goal within that model, especially moving up in a weight class. However, it's not the primary goal of that model. And so what I would be looking to do is use the hypertrophy programming to not only address the skeletal muscle accumulation that we need, but potentially to also address the movement issues that would allow that athlete to then stay healthy through the strength block that's going to carry them into the meet preps. So I would preface all of this with that, because then if you come into this conversation with that understanding, it changes how you look at volume accumulation over time. Because when we discuss this volume accumulation across a block, it's to create that adaptation of hypertrophy as the primary adaptation. And so I think this even further pushes us towards less variance in the accumulation over time, so that we know that that athlete's not too far from a quick deload and transition into a new block. And I think that it comes with the understanding that hypertrophy is secondary to the strength outcome, where we can now have a program structure that's going to bias that, and also potentially address an issue that is going to allow them to perform better in the big 3 within that block that's further away from the meet, where they can spend that time addressing it. And so probably not quite the answer that you were looking for, as far as like, what does that exactly look like from a volume accumulation side? I think it is an opportunity to grow and use nutrition from a surplus perspective in order to grow into that new class in the situation that you gave. But it also has to, again, it has to set up that next portion of the block that's going to lead into the meet prep. So that'd be kind of my 2 cents on taking it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective to have, because, like, obviously, I'm assuming this has also to do with sort of like changes in pronation angle and cross-sectional area, obviously, you know, changing sort of how you're going to move. And so say, for example, you had an athlete like myself, very, very long femurs, short to torso, not built well for squats. My own quads are a little bit lagging. When most of your exercise selection basically be like, let's hammer into this guy's quads so he doesn't get called chicken legs.
Right. Yeah. And so it may be one of those things where, like, okay, what is going to allow this individual athlete to move better throughout a squat pattern, but still develop the quad capacity from not only from a muscle standpoint, like hypertrophy, but, you know, a capacity to express that strength in the squat pattern. And so, like, functionally, I'm looking at, like, first one that comes to mind is like a contralateral Bulgarian split squat. And so that would be kind of like a staple within the program design, right? And so contralateral loaded Bulgarian split. And that's just one example, right? I mean, this is going to have to be within the confines of a full program model. And I think if you look at the hypertrophy block on the forefront of that, the focus should be creating the primary athlete's goal, which is why it gets less nuanced the further away that hypertrophy gets as the primary objective. And so this is where like potentially these hypertrophy blocks are not overly similar to what it would look like for a bodybuilder, where hypertrophy is the end all be all.
So would you mind giving an example of that?
Yeah. So, all right. So we talked about like accumulating volume from potentially MEV all the way to MRV for an athlete, whether you fall within that model or something that's similar to mine, that's kind of halfway between. When we look at like driving the adaptation of hypertrophy within a strength athlete, and this may help. So there's a researcher named Dr. Buckner. He's out of the University of South Florida. He's done a lot of research in like blood flow restriction, and kind of got his grad degree from Ole Miss out of Dr. Lineke's lab. And so there's a large amount of data that's basically just showing the dissociation between hypertrophy and strength. And so it's the dissociation of those two. And so if we take that understanding and we take that data and we then cross apply this into the program, that it's going to be like the hypertrophy based focus before someone gets into a meet prep, we can understand that hypertrophy is a goal in order to allow for someone to grow into a bigger weight class, but it's not going to be the end all be all when we look to transition that into strength outcomes across the strength main blocks. And so we're going to be regulating the overall volume accumulation in order to keep that athlete in a realm where he can adapt from a strength perspective and adapt from a hypertrophy perspective. It's kind of like when you look at a continuation of adaptation, like hypertrophy and endurance training are in two very large ends of the spectrum, and then strength kind of falls somewhere in the middle, potentially a little bit closer to hypertrophy. And so we're kind of moving that extreme hypertrophy end of the spectrum over into the strength block. So there's less aspects of that volume accumulation, hypertrophy focused block within that block, even though it's called a hypertrophy block, because we still need to maintain the adaptations of strength that athlete has as the primary goal of the end result of the process in 6 months' time. And so I'm not disassociating the strength athlete from the strength portion of the adaptation continuum, as far as I'm disassociating a bodybuilding athlete from the strength portion of the adaptation continuum.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So it's essentially, you're always keeping that primary goal in mind, that like strength is like the ultimate goal, and we don't want whatever we're doing with hypertrophy to interfere with being able to sort of detect, progress on the primary objective. Similar to, how if you're doing hypertrophy training and you're like, you're not really having a surplus, you're not really seeing body weight train up over time. No matter how much volume that you're doing, you're not going to really get that much bigger unless you have like a degree of body fat stores. Like, I think Mike Israel made a really great video on this on Renaissance periodization. It's like people have this really big misconception that like just lifting weights in and of itself gets you big, and it's like you have to have nutrition be facilitative of that, because obviously we know that recomposition can happen, but it's very nuanced. You have probably more novice beginner. You also need to have like the energy stores to actually draw on. And I'm assuming that you're relatively lean, which I think most people looking to maximize both strength and hypertrophy probably should be most of the time, probably within that 10 to 20% range. You don't really want to, I guess, hedge all your bets on recomposition, because like basically like we want to have as predictable of an outcome as you possibly can have in any of the training phases. And essentially how we structure our programming needs to always remember like what is that specific goal is. Specificity is the number one aspect of like any sort of programming, and we cannot forget that and move away from that and in search of like other things like that are less important, like variation and overload and all that stuff. So
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I think that we basically addressed a lot of this, essentially you know, for certain athletes, you know, always, you know, hypertrophy, you know, for maintenance of, you know, obviously building more muscle. There's a sort of connection, like you said, on that continuum between hypertrophy and strength. We don't want to get too far away from that main goal. We want to essentially focus on, you know, also like hypertrophy should be centered around how is this athlete going to help them move better and their strength oriented work primarily. I guess now going a little bit into the nutrition side in terms of, you know, hypertrophy. I think one of the most interesting conversations is sort of how would you contrast rates of gain in some sort of in some individual who is enhanced versus who is natural in terms of how fast should they be gaining weight. And I think that this becomes even more complicated in the sense of, like I mentioned earlier, there's other factors that play with PED use and escalating dosage with, you know, and also with compound use. So how would you change? So I guess first starting off from the natty perspective is a little bit easier to quantify. How would you go about that?
Yeah, so most of the time, like people will use percentage of body weight to kind of contextualize this. And I think it's fairly accurate to potentially just use it from an anecdotal perspective, talk relative amount of pounds per week, depending on the size of the athlete, because there's so much variability across natural to enhanced to what is the enhanced athlete from an experience level. So to start from the natural realm, for most natural athletes, like obviously smaller in overall mass relative to their PED counterparts. So most, from a male bodybuilder perspective, at a full contest shape, are landing somewhere between 140 pounds to 175, 180, maybe at the top end. Occasionally you're getting genetic freaks, but not really large individuals. So then it's not to say they don't have a higher level of muscularity, especially when they get in contest shape, just relative to, you know, open class bodybuilders, right? In the PED world. So when we look at rates of gain, I think it's fairly accurate saying, assuming we're out of the post-show window, we're just kind of in the off-season phase and being progressive over time, to see about 0.25 to 0.5 pounds per week. I think if we look at that across the scale of a month, that's probably somewhere between 4 to 6 pounds a month of a rate of gain. Obviously, that's going to allow that athlete to gain performance from the increased body weight, especially from a leverage perspective. They're going to accumulate muscle tissue, but they're also going to accumulate some body fat. And we can do that and be progressive over the duration of the accumulation phase and not have that athlete get too far out from a composition perspective. Because essentially we're just going to be running this off-season progression phase into a transition or a hold. Depending on that athlete's body composition, it tells you whether you need to dial it back into a diet phase before you go pushing again. And then you're going to run that rate of progress up as well. So a lot of times you'll see that kind of rate of progress for a natural athlete is fairly accurate. Again, relative to the total amount of mass that individual carries and the experience level. Experience level can influence this too, in regards to just, you know, how much adaptation they're gaining. A very advanced athlete is not going to gain a large amount of hypertrophy adaptation if they've been doing it for 15 years, right? Versus a beginner who can accumulate tissue at a little bit of a rather fast rate. So probably in the ballpark realm for that. You know, you could potentially say 0.75 pounds to a pound per week for the beginner, potentially, I guess. But overall, probably not getting out of the confines of that. Now with the PD or enhanced athlete, the variability is going to come with compound inclusion. What does that accumulation look like? What does that accumulation lead up to? Is there a growth hormone in play or not? Is that growth hormone accumulating over time? So a lot of variables that can skew this rate of gain overall. But most of the time, what we're seeing is going to be kind of around that 0.75 to 2 pounds per week, depending on where the athlete's at in their process. I would say for most athletes, probably closer to that 0.75 pounds per week in the most part for a productive all-season phase, once they're kind of past like compound introduction and any of these other things that could skew the overall metrics. And because if you add that up over time, like, and you have a 6 months progressive off season phase, like let's just say they do on average a pound a week over a 4 month progressive push or a 5 month progressive push. I mean, that's a large, I mean, that's 20 pounds up, right? On a 5 month progressive phase. So it's a fairly large jump in body weight when we know in 5 months time, we're not accumulating 20 pounds of tissue. So I think it's fairly safe to say, you know, you're gaining about a pound a month body of skeletal muscle from a PED enhanced athlete, barring your genetic elite. And kind of associating that with, for every pound of tissue gain, we're gaining 2-ish pounds of fat, and just kind of running that ratio as we go up.
So a little bit more sort of with the rate of gain as with an enhanced athlete, just because like on there they're a little bit more able to add tissue, and I guess like sort of like just accepting, you know, that fat tissue is like just insurance policy that you're actually like maximizing that cycle or whatnot, because there's obviously a health trade-off. How much of body weight do you like to see, like on minimum, like per like sort of phase of weight gain, do you like to see with most people? So like there's a lot of people when they go into surplus, like I'm guilty of this too, it's like you see some softness sort of, and then you're like, oh crap, like gotta cut again because like my abs are getting a little bit blurry. How much do you like to see in terms of a phase of muscle gain, in terms of, you know, say just absolute pounds or body weight percentage up in a phase?
Yeah, so again, depending on the level of the athlete, I'll give potentially 2 extreme
Let's
examples.
say intermediates or something like that.
Yeah, so an intermediate. So add a couple cycles under their belt. Potentially they're kind of getting into the medium risk model from an accumulation standpoint. Across an off-season phase, it's fairly common to see someone come up 15 to 20 pounds. It depends on the duration of that off-season phase. But I think that's fairly accurate for most off-season pushes. Now, there's some cases where that won't be the case. So I'll give you mine as an example, just because it's fresh and it's pretty easy to cite. This most recent push came off of me doing IVF with my wife. So this was about 5 months to 6 months of very low clinical values from a test perspective, in order to kind of go through the fertility process. So I actually lost a bit of tissue throughout that process, and body composition wasn't at its greatest. So I ended the push beforehand around 252. By the time that I ended that fertility phase, I was like 246, but my body composition was slightly worse than where I ended that push because of just some of the stuff that we were doing from a fertility perspective. So what that phase looked like, that push-up phase looked like, was a diet phase down to about 237, and then I pushed back up to about 249. So net across a push, you could say that was like 12 to 13 pounds, but that wasn't over the duration of the entire push. And body composition at 249 is better than it was at 246 at the start of the push. So net across that push, it's only 3 pounds up, but we also have to remember where that athlete is coming from and pushing into. So it's fairly safe to say over a 20 to 24 week, like most of those athletes are going to be somewhere in that 15 to potentially 24, 23 pounds of weight gained across that phase. I think if we did like 24 weeks, it's fairly safe to say that if the athlete was in pretty good shape, 24 to 25 pounds is fairly acceptable. But when we look at potentially, hey, does this athlete need to cut again on the back end? I think it's okay to take off-season pushes a little bit past where the start of a contest prep would be. I think this is where, you know, getting into new levels of tissue needs to happen. And then you can just rinse it off on the back end, whether you're in the baseline phase or at the start of your next accumulation. And so, like, for example, like my body fat percentage right now is probably not at peak body fat percentage for a peak off season for me. So I now have more room on that next accumulation where I don't necessarily need to diet to go into that phase. But if I had gone up another 2, 3, 4 pounds, it probably would have been at that place where at this point in time, I needed to pull off a bit, and I could have just done that across the baseline phase. So it wasn't too much of a concern. So you spend some time solidifying the gains in the first portion of the baseline, diet into the accumulation, and then push up from there. I know that doesn't really give like objective data for the people, but when we look at visuals, I don't like my guys getting above really 16%, 15, 16%, to be honest.
What are some markers that you sort of look for at like each body fat per percentage? Well, let's say just like 8%, 10%, 12%, 15, like that sort of mark.
I don't do it relative to body fat percentage. I do it relative to performance in the gym and subjective metrics outside of that. So are they at 10% and are obsessing over food and are starving all the time and can't like even focus on what they're supposed to be doing because they have such a high food focus? Or are they at 10% and they can barely fit more food in their mouth and are like at the very end of like barely being able to add more food to the plan? So that's the reason why I don't do it relative to the percentage. What I'm looking at more so is subjective metrics throughout the day, performance within the gym, health metrics. So this would include blood glucose, blood pressure. Am I having to use interventions to manage that? So am I introducing a basal insulin to manage blood glucose because that athlete is having issues with managing it on their own? Am I having to use blood pressure medication in order to manage that athlete's blood pressure? Those are probably the things that are ending push phases more than body fat percentage for most people if it's done at a very high level, because body fat percentage will come up and you'll reach that peak look that I'll see that body fat might be a little bit too far for the start of a prep, but it's still like within reason for an off season. And it's more so these other metrics that are kind of leaving us where we got to stop. And that's okay. And that's kind of part of the game of which each athlete is finding what that metric is. Because I also have athletes who like are very like on the extreme end of body composition where they almost stay lean year round. And it's like, you look at them visually without looking at any of the other metrics, you're like, man, you're just starting a push up now. But it's like, you look at these metrics and caloric intakes at like 6,400. They're using 20 IUs of Lantus to manage their blood glucose and 40 mgs of telmisartan with a calcium channel blocker is barely keeping their blood pressure in range. It's like, okay, yeah, you can't go any further, right? So that's why I don't look at body fat percentage when making that decision. I'm looking at these other things in order to make that decision for me.
I like that perspective because it takes into account the individual differences because everybody is different. I'm one of those people where like, I'm like, I don't feel good. I can know some health markers getting skewed when I get to like around like that 12% body fat, which is like.
See, I'm the opposite. I'm like 14% and like not even at peak body fat percentage for where I feel good. So it's like, this is a prime example of like, where does this athlete thrive at? It's like, man, for you probably thrive between 8 to 10. That's probably where you feel.
Yep, that's where I'm at right now, like all the time. Yep. And
so like for me, it's like somewhere between 12 to 14% is probably where I feel my best. And it's like, athletes are different, man, and it just changes how these off-season phases look for those athletes.
Yeah, I also think that's just important because we need to remind ourselves that like nutrition is supportive of that muscle growth, and really what's driving that muscle growth is the actual training stimulus. So really being in a spot where you can productively train, recover, and help is permissive of that performance. Because if you're unhealthy, I mean that shortens careers, and dying is also not conducive to gains. That's a great way to short circuit things. So
yeah, sure.
Luke, I want to thank you a lot for your time. I know you're a very busy man. Where can people find you if they want to like learn a little bit more about your content and potentially hire you as a coach?
Yeah, so No Switch Fitness is pretty much across all platforms. Instagram, No Switch Fitness, YouTube, No Switch Fitness. We even have a TikTok, but I don't post on there much. So that would be kind of where to find me mostly. J3 University, I'm very active on the forums. I do a Q&A every other week for all of the J3 University members. We also have the J3 University podcast where we pretty much put a podcast a week going over any kind of content that can entail. And we also have the new female module coming out for J3 University fairly soon. So fully comprehensive module for anything coaching a female that you could potentially run across. So super excited for that. So that's typically the main places people can find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I'll make sure I include all the information in the notes of the show, and make sure you guys follow Luke. On outside, it's cool like following like I like seeing like a big dude like get big, because like I don't think people understand how hard that actually is to like get like that big. So like I commend your efforts there. I'm just a skinny 5'11", 190, 192. So hope to potentially be a big boy too.
You'll get there, man. It's just time.
Yeah, that's probably the hardest aspect of it, just being patient, not rushing the process. So thank you again. And if you guys have been sorry, I guess talk guys until next week. Bye.